The storm came without warning, as storms always did in the Carpathian Mountains. Thunder rolled across the blackened sky like the drums of some ancient, forgotten war, and lightning split the darkness in jagged silver veins. Count Dracula stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking the valley below, his long coat whipping in the wind, his pale face turned upward to meet the fury of the heavens. He did not feel the cold. He had not felt warmth or cold for centuries. The rain began to fall in thick, heavy sheets, drenching the rocky landscape and turning the dirt roads below into rivers of mud. Dracula closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, tasting the storm on his tongue, the ozone, the earth, the distant scent of livestock and human sweat from the villages far below. He could hear their heartbeats even from this distance, 1,000 tiny drums beating out the rhythm of mortal life. It was a sound that once comforted him. Now it only reminded him of what he had lost. He turned away from the cliff and began to walk. His boots made no sound against the wet stone. He moved like a shadow, like smoke, like something that existed between the worlds of the living and the dead. He had no destination in mind. He rarely did anymore. The night stretched endlessly before him, one bleeding into the next, each as hollow as the last. He had drunk his fill of blood earlier that evening, a traveler who had foolishly ventured too close to his castle, but the hunger never truly left him. It was not a hunger of the body, it was a hunger of the soul. The wind howled through the trees as he descended into the forest, the branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The storm intensified, and even the wolves that usually followed him kept their distance, their yellow eyes glowing in the darkness, before vanishing into the underbrush. Dracula walked for hours, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time meant nothing to him anymore. He had existed for so long that the seasons blurred together, centuries folding into one another like pages in a book he had read too many times. Then he saw it, a flicker of light in the distance, faint and trembling like a dying candle. A tavern. He could smell the wood smoke from its chimney, the stale ale, the unwashed bodies of the few patrons huddled inside. He had no interest in such places, no need for the company of mortals, but something drew him forward. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps it was simply the storm, or perhaps it was something deeper, something he did not yet understand. The tavern was a sagging, decrepit structure that looked as though it might collapse under the weight of the rain. Its shutters hung loose on rusted hinges, banging against the walls with each gust of wind. The door was half open, swinging slowly back and forth, creaking like the groan of a dying man. Dracula paused at the threshold, his eyes narrowing. The scent of death hung in the air, faint but unmistakable. Something had died here recently, or something was dying. He stepped inside. The tavern was abandoned. Tables were overturned, chairs lay scattered across the floor, and broken glass glittered in the dim light of a single flickering lantern. The fireplace was cold, its ashes long since turned grey. Blood stained the walls in dark, rust-colored streaks, and the floor was sticky with it. Dracula's eyes scanned the room with the practiced ease of a predator, taking in every detail, every shadow. Whatever had happened here, it had been violent and recent. The smell of blood was overwhelming, thick and cloying in the stale air. He could identify at least 3 different sources, 2 men and 1 woman. The woman's blood was the freshest, no more than a day old. The men had died perhaps 2 days before. There were signs of a struggle, claw marks on the wooden beams, broken furniture, a shattered crucifix lying in a pool of congealed blood. Something supernatural had been here, something that walked the line between beast and man. Then he heard it, a sound so faint that even his supernatural senses almost missed it. A soft, wet chewing, the crunch of bread, the scrape of small fingers against wood. He turned toward the sound, his gaze falling on a dark corner near the back of the tavern. There, huddled beneath a broken table, was a child. She could not have been more than 5 years old. Her dress was little more than rags, torn and filthy, clinging to her thin frame like a second skin. Her hair was long and tangled, the color of midnight, and it hung in matted clumps around her face. Her skin was pale, deathly pale, and her bare feet were covered in cuts and bruises. She was gnawing on a piece of moldy bread, her small hands clutching it as though it were the most precious thing in the world. Dracula stood perfectly still, watching her. She had not yet noticed him. She was too focused on her meal, her tiny teeth tearing into the stale bread with desperate hunger. Her breathing was shallow and labored, and her ribs were visible beneath the torn fabric of her dress. She was starving. How long had she been here? How long had she been alone? But it was not her hunger that held Dracula's attention. It was her eyes. She looked up suddenly as though sensing his presence, and their gazes locked. Dracula felt something twist inside his chest, a sensation he had not felt in so long that he had forgotten its name. Her eyes were crimson. Not the brown or blue or green of mortal children, but crimson, deep, blood-red, glowing faintly in the darkness like embers in a dying fire. They were his eyes. The child stared at him, unblinking, unafraid. There was no innocence in that gaze, no childish wonder, only a hollow, ancient weariness, as though she had lived 1,000 lifetimes and found them all wanting. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with the same intensity that he was studying her. Her face was gaunt, her cheeks sunken, but beneath the dirt and the suffering he could see the shape of her features, the high cheekbones, the sharp line of her jaw, the delicate curve of her lips. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected not his present self, but the child he had once been centuries ago before the curse had taken him. "Are you going to kill me?" she asked. Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it carried through the silence like a bell. Dracula did not answer. He could not. His mind was reeling, his thoughts a chaotic storm. Those eyes, that face, the shape of her nose, the curve of her lips, the way her hair fell across her forehead, it was all familiar, impossibly familiar. He took a step forward, and the child flinched but did not run. She pressed herself against the wall, clutching the bread to her chest, her red eyes wide and watchful. Dracula knelt down slowly, bringing himself to her level. He reached out with one pale hand, his fingers trembling, a tremor he could not control. When was the last time his hands had trembled? When was the last time he had felt anything at all? "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. The child did not answer immediately. She simply stared at him, her crimson eyes reflecting his own monstrous face. And then, slowly, she smiled. It was a small, sad smile, the kind of smile that belonged to someone who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. "My name is Elena," she said. "My mother told me about you. She said you were a monster. She said you would come for me one day." Dracula's hand froze in mid-air. "Your mother," he repeated, his voice barely audible. "Who is your mother?" The child's smile faded, and tears began to well in her crimson eyes. "Her name was Elena," she whispered. "She's dead now." "They killed her." The name struck him like a blade to the heart. Elena. The memory came flooding back, unbidden and unwelcome, a memory he had buried so deeply that he had almost convinced himself it was a dream. A single night, 5 years ago. A woman with dark hair and eyes like the night sky, who had wandered into his castle seeking shelter from a storm much like this one. A woman who had looked at him not with fear, but with pity. A woman who had touched his face and whispered, "You were human once, I can still see it in your eyes." He had expected her to scream, to run, to beg for her life. Instead, she had sat with him in the great hall of his castle, by the fire that burned but gave no warmth, and she had talked to him as though he were still a man. She had told him about her life in the village, about her dreams of seeing the world beyond the mountains, about the loneliness that had driven her to wander the roads at night. And he had listened. God help him. He had listened. And for those few hours, he had felt almost human again. When dawn approached, he had let her go. He had not fed on her, had not turned her, had not kept her as so many before her. He had let her walk out of his castle and into the dawn, and he had never seen her again. He had told himself it was because she meant nothing to him, but that was a lie. She had meant everything, and he had been too much of a coward to admit it, even to himself. And now, here was her child, his child. "They killed her," Elena repeated, her voice breaking. "The men from the village. They said she was cursed. They said I was cursed. They burned our house and they... She trailed off, her small body beginning to shake. "I ran. I've been running for days. I don't have anywhere to go. I don't have anyone." Dracula stared at her, his mind a battlefield of emotions he had thought long dead. Rage, guilt, grief, and beneath it all, a terrible, aching tenderness. This child was his. His blood ran through her veins. His curse lived in her eyes. She was proof that even monsters could create life, even if that life was doomed from the start. He reached out again, and this time she did not flinch. He cupped her small, dirt-streaked face in his hand, his thumb brushing away a tear that had begun to roll down her cheek. She was so fragile, so mortal. Her heartbeat was faint but steady, a delicate rhythm that reminded him of a bird's wings. And yet, she was also something else, something darker, something damned. "You will not run anymore," he said quietly. You are mine, and I protect what is mine." Ilara's eyes widened, and for the first time, a flicker of hope passed across her face. "Will you take care of me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Will you keep me safe?" Dracula hesitated. He was a monster. He had been a monster for so long that he barely remembered what it was like to be human. He had killed without mercy, fed without remorse, destroyed lives, and crushed souls beneath his heel. He had no right to care for this child, no right to pretend he could give her anything but darkness and death. And yet, as he looked into her crimson eyes, his eyes, he knew he could not turn away. She was his daughter, his blood, his curse, and she had no one else. "Yes," he said, "I will take care of you." He lifted her into his arms, and she did not resist. She was light as a feather, her body frail and weak from days of starvation. She rested her head against his chest, her small hands clutching at his coat, and for the first time in centuries, Dracula felt something stir within him. Not hunger, not rage, but something softer, something that almost felt like love. The storm continued to rage outside as he carried her out of the tavern and into the night. The rain soaked through her ragged dress, but she did not shiver. She simply closed her eyes and let herself be carried, her breathing slow and steady. Dracula looked down at her, this impossible child, this cursed miracle, and he felt the weight of eternity settle onto his shoulders once more. He had lost Elena, but he would not lose Ilara, not to the mortals who hunted her, not to the darkness that threatened to consume her, not even to death itself. She was his daughter, and he would protect her no matter the cost, even if it meant facing the one thing he feared more than anything else, his own humanity. The journey back to Castle Dracula took the remainder of the night. Dracula moved through the forest with supernatural speed, his daughter cradled against his chest, her small body limp with exhaustion. She had fallen asleep almost immediately, her head resting in the crook of his arm, her tiny fingers still clutching the moldy bread she had refused to let go. He did not take it from her. It was all she had left of her mortal life, and he understood the need to hold on to such things, no matter how worthless they might seem. The storm had begun to fade as they climbed higher into the mountains, the thunder growing distant, the rain softening to a light drizzle. The clouds parted briefly and moonlight spilled across the landscape, illuminating the twisted trees and jagged rocks that lined the path. Dracula glanced down at Ilara's face, pale and peaceful in sleep, and felt that strange stirring in his chest again. It was not love. He told himself it could not be love. Love was for the living, and he was anything but. Yet as he looked at her, he could not deny the pull he felt toward this child. She was a part of him, a part of Elena, a part of the man he had once been, before the curse had stripped away everything that made him human. She was a reminder that he had not always been a monster, and that terrified him more than anything else. The castle loomed before him as he crested the final ridge, its dark silhouette rising against the night sky like a tombstone. The towers stretched upward into the clouds, their spires sharp and menacing, and the walls were thick with centuries of moss and ivy. Windows glowed faintly with candlelight, though no living soul dwelled within. Only his servants remained, creatures bound to him by blood and oath, neither fully alive nor fully dead. He crossed the drawbridge, the wood groaning beneath his weight, and the great iron gates swung open without a sound. Inside, the courtyard was dark and silent, the cobblestones slick with rain. Shadows moved along the walls, but they did not approach. They knew better than to disturb their master when he walked with purpose. Dracula carried Ilara through the main entrance and into the grand hall. The room was vast, with vaulted ceilings that disappeared into darkness and stone pillars carved with the faces of long-dead kings. A fire burned in the massive hearth at the far end of the hall, its flames casting flickering shadows across the walls. The heat did not touch him, but he knew the child would need it. He moved toward the fire and gently laid Ilara on the floor before it, careful not to wake her. She stirred slightly, her brow furrowing, but she did not open her eyes. He removed his coat and draped it over her small body, covering her torn dress and the bruises that marked her skin. She looked so fragile lying there, so impossibly small against the vastness of the hall. How had she survived this long? How had she endured the cruelty of the world without breaking? "Master." The voice came from the shadows, low and gravelly, and Dracula turned to see his most trusted servant emerge from the darkness. Renfield was a hunched, wiry man, with sunken eyes and skin like parchment. He had served Dracula for decades, bound by a curse of his own, a hunger for insects and small creatures that kept him tethered to the castle. He was loyal, obedient, and utterly mad, but he was also useful. "Who is the child?" Renfield asked, his gaze flicking to Ilara with a mixture of curiosity and unease. "She is mine," Dracula said simply. "You will prepare a room for her. She will need food, clean water, and clothing. See to it immediately." Renfield blinked, his mouth opening and closing as though he were trying to process the command. "A child, master. Here. But do as I say," Dracula interrupted, his voice cold and final. "Or I will find another servant who will." Renfield flinched and bowed low, his hands trembling. "Yes, master. At once, master." He scurried away, disappearing into the shadows, and Dracula turned his attention back to Ilara. She had begun to stir, her eyelids fluttering as consciousness slowly returned. She opened her eyes and stared up at the ceiling, her crimson gaze unfocused and confused. Then she turned her head and saw Dracula standing over her, and her expression shifted from confusion to recognition. She sat up slowly, clutching his coat around her shoulders, and looked around the grand hall with wide eyes. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "My home," Dracula said. "You are safe here." Ilara's gaze moved from the fire to the stone pillars, to the shadows that clung to the walls. She did not look afraid, but she did not look comforted either. "This place is dark," she said quietly. "It feels like a tomb." "It is," Dracula admitted. "But it is also a fortress. No one will harm you here." Ilara pulled the coat tighter around herself and stared into the fire. The flames reflected in her crimson eyes, making them glow even brighter. "They said I was a demon," she whispered. "They said my eyes were the devil's eyes. They said I didn't deserve to live." Dracula knelt beside her, his movements slow and deliberate. "They were fools," he said. "Your eyes are not the devil's. They are mine, and I will not let anyone hurt you because of them." Ilara looked up at him, her small face pale and drawn. "Are you really my father?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible to ignore. Dracula had no experience with children, no understanding of how to comfort them or ease their fears. He had been a soldier once, a warrior, a leader of men, but that was lifetimes ago, and the man he had been was long dead. All that remained was the monster. "Yes," he said finally, "I am your father." Ilara's lower lip began to tremble, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "My mother said you were terrible," she whispered. "She said you were cruel and heartless. She said you didn't care about anyone but yourself." Dracula felt those words cut deeper than any blade. Elena had been right, of course. He was terrible, he was cruel, he was heartless. But hearing it spoken aloud, by his own daughter, was a pain he had not anticipated. "She was right," he said quietly. "I am all of those things. But I will not let that harm you. You are mine, Ilara, and I protect what is mine." Ilara stared at him for a long moment, her crimson eyes searching his face as though looking for something, truth, perhaps, or hope. Then, slowly, she reached out and touched his hand. Her fingers were small and cold, and they trembled as they wrapped around his. "Will you teach me?" she asked. "Will you teach me how to be like you?" Dracula felt his heart, if he still had one, twist painfully in his chest. "Like me," he repeated. "You do not want to be like me, child." "But I already am," Ilara said, her voice breaking. "I have your eyes. I have your blood. The villagers said I was cursed. They said I would grow up to be a monster, just like you." She looked down at her hands, her tears falling onto the stone floor. "If I'm going to be a monster, then I want to be strong. I don't want to be afraid anymore." Dracula stared at her, his mind racing. She was only 5 years old, but she had already endured more pain and suffering than most mortals experienced in a lifetime. She had watched her mother die. She had been hunted, starved, and left to survive alone in a world that wanted her dead. And now she stood before him, asking him to teach her how to embrace the very darkness that had destroyed him. He should have refused. He should have told her that she was not cursed, that she was not a monster, that she could still live a mortal life if she tried hard enough. But that would have been a lie. The moment she was born with his blood in her veins, her fate was sealed. The world would never accept her. The villagers would never stop hunting her, and if he did not teach her how to survive, she would die. "Very well," he said finally. "I will teach you, but you must understand something, Ilara. The path I walk is one of darkness and blood. If you follow me, there will be no turning back. You will become something that mortals fear and despise. You will never know peace. You will never know love. Is that truly what you want?" Ilara looked up at him, her crimson eyes filled with determination. "I don't want peace," she said. "I want to live." Dracula felt something shift inside him, a crack in the armor he had built around his heart. This child was brave, braver than he had been when he first embraced the curse. She did not cry or beg or plead for mercy. She simply accepted her fate and chose to face it head-on. She was, in many ways, stronger than he had ever been. "Then you will live," he said. "I swear it." At that moment, Renfield returned, carrying a bundle of clothing and a tray of food. He set them down near the fire and bowed low. "The room is ready, master," he said. "I have prepared the east wing chamber. It has a bed, a wardrobe, and a window that overlooks the courtyard." Dracula nodded. "Good. Take her there. See that she eats and rests. Tomorrow her training will begin." Renfield's eyes widened in surprise, but he said nothing. He simply bowed again and gestured for Elena to follow him. The child stood slowly, still clutching Dracula's coat around her shoulders, and looked back at him one last time. "Thank you," she whispered. Dracula did not reply. He simply watched as Renfield led her away, her small figure disappearing into the shadows of the castle. When she was gone, he turned back to the fire and stared into the flames, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. He had made a promise to protect her, but could he truly keep it? Could a monster like him raise a child without destroying her in the process? He did not know, but he would try, for Elena's sake, for Elena's sake, and perhaps for his own. Because for the first time in centuries, he had something worth fighting for, something worth living for, and he would not let the darkness take it away. The first rays of dawn crept through the narrow window of Elena's chamber, pale and weak, barely penetrating the thick stone walls of Castle Dracula. She stirred beneath the heavy blankets, her small body warm for the first time in days. The bed was soft, far softer than anything she had ever known. The pillows smelled of lavender and dust, and the sheets were clean though yellowed with age. She opened her crimson eyes and stared at the ceiling, trying to remember where she was. Then it all came back. The tavern, the storm, the pale man with eyes like hers, her father. She sat up slowly, her gaze sweeping across the room. It was larger than the entire house she had shared with her mother, with tall windows draped in heavy velvet curtains, a carved wooden wardrobe that stood against one wall, and a fireplace where embers still glowed faintly. A painting hung above the mantel, a woman in a white gown, her face beautiful but sad, her eyes looking somewhere far away. Elena wondered who she was. A soft knock sounded at the door, and before she could answer, it creaked open. Renfield entered, carrying another tray of food. His hunched form cast strange shadows on the walls, and his eyes darted nervously around the room before settling on her. "Good morning, young mistress," he said, his voice raspy and uncertain. "The master instructed me to bring you breakfast. You must eat. You must grow strong." Elena looked at the tray. There was bread, fresh this time, not moldy, and cheese, cold meat, a bowl of soup, and a cup of milk. Her stomach twisted with hunger, but she hesitated. "Where is he?" she asked. "Where is my father?" "The master rests during the day," Renfield said, setting the tray on a small table near the window. "He will come for you when the sun sets. Until then, you are to eat, bathe, and dress. The master has laid out clothing for you." He gestured to the wardrobe, then shuffled toward the door. "Do not leave this room, young mistress. The castle is not safe during the day." "Why not?" Elena asked. Renfield paused, his hand on the door handle. He turned back to her, his sunken eyes filled with something that might have been pity. "Because there are things in this castle that even the master cannot fully control," he said quietly. "Things that hunger, things that do not care whether you are his daughter or not." He left before she could ask anything more, the door closing behind him with a heavy thud. Elena stared at it for a long moment, then turned her attention to the food. She ate slowly at first, savoring each bite, but soon her hunger overtook her and she devoured everything on the tray. When she was finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and stood. The wardrobe was old and ornate, its surface carved with images of roses and thorns. She opened it carefully and found several dresses inside, all of them dark, black, deep purple, crimson. They were too large for her, clearly made for someone older, but they were clean and well made. She chose a simple black dress and struggled into it, the fabric pooling around her feet. She would have to grow into it. She moved to the window and pushed aside the heavy curtain, wincing as sunlight flooded the room. It burned her eyes, and she quickly stepped back into the shadows. Her skin prickled uncomfortably, and she realized with growing unease that the light hurt her. Not as badly as it would have hurt her father, she suspected, but enough to make her avoid it. She was changing, becoming something else, something darker. The hours passed slowly. Ilara explored the room, examined the painting, tried to read the spines of the books that lined a small shelf near the fireplace. Most of them were written in languages she did not understand. She grew restless, pacing back and forth, waiting for the sun to set, waiting for her father to come. Finally, as the light outside began to fade and the shadows in the room grew longer, she heard footsteps in the corridor, heavy, deliberate. The door opened, and Dracula stepped inside. He looked different in the dim light of evening. His pale skin seemed to glow faintly, and his crimson eyes burned with an intensity that made her breath catch. He was dressed in black, as always, his long coat sweeping behind him like wings. He studied her for a moment, his gaze taking in the dress that hung loosely on her small frame, and something that might have been approval flickered across his face. "You are awake," he said. "Good, come with me." Ilara followed him out of the room and down a long corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women. She recognized none of them, but she felt their painted eyes following her as she walked. The castle was a labyrinth of stone and shadow, with staircases that spiraled upward into darkness and hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. Dracula moved through it with ease, his steps silent, his presence commanding. Ilara hurried to keep up, her small feet pattering against the cold floor. They descended into the lower levels of the castle, where the air grew colder, and the torches on the walls burned with an eerie green flame. The stone here was darker, almost black, and the walls were damp with moisture. Ilara shivered, pulling the oversized dress tighter around herself. Dracula stopped before a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bands. He pushed it open, and the hinges groaned in protest. Beyond was a vast chamber, circular and high-ceilinged, with chains hanging from the walls and strange symbols carved into the floor. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, stained with something dark and old. "This is where your training will begin," Dracula said, stepping inside. "If you are to survive in this world, Ilara, you must understand what you are. You are not fully human. You are not fully vampire. You are something in between. A dhampir. A child of two worlds belonging to neither." Ilara stared at the altar, her heart pounding. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It means you have the strengths of both," Dracula said, turning to face her. "You have human resilience, mortal cunning, and the ability to walk in sunlight, though it will weaken you. But you also have my blood. You are faster than mortals, stronger than children your age should be, and your senses are sharper. In time, those gifts will grow, but only if you learn to control them." He moved to the center of the room and gestured for her to join him. Ilara hesitated, then stepped forward, her bare feet cold against the stone floor. Dracula knelt before her, bringing himself to her level, and placed a hand on her shoulder. "The world will hate you," he said quietly. "Mortals will see your eyes and call you a demon. Vampires will see your heartbeat and call you an abomination. You will be hunted by both. But if you are strong, if you are cunning, if you learn to embrace what you are, you will survive, you will thrive. Do you understand?" Ilara nodded, though she did not fully understand. She only knew that she wanted to be strong. She wanted to never feel helpless again. "Good," Dracula said. He stood and moved to one of the walls, where a collection of weapons hung. Swords, daggers, crossbows, and things she did not recognize. He selected a small dagger, its blade silver and gleaming, and returned to her. He held it out, handle first. "Take it," he said. Ilara reached out and wrapped her small fingers around the handle. The blade was heavier than she expected, and her hand trembled with the effort of holding it. Dracula watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. "A blade is an extension of yourself," he said. "It is not a toy. It is not a tool. It is a part of you. When you hold it, you must feel it as though it were your own hand. Do you feel it?" Ilara nodded, though she was not sure she did. "Good. Now strike me." Ilara's eyes widened. "What?" "Strike me," Dracula repeated. "Use the blade. Try to cut me." "But I—" "Do it." Ilara swallowed hard, her hands shaking. She did not want to hurt him. He was her father, but his gaze was stern, commanding, and she knew he would not accept refusal. She raised the dagger with both hands and swung it toward him, aiming for his arm. He caught her wrist before the blade could touch him, his grip firm but not painful. "Too slow," he said. "Too obvious. You telegraphed your intent before you even moved. If this were a real fight, you would be dead." He released her wrist and stepped back. Again, Ilara tried again, and again he stopped her effortlessly. She tried a third time, a fourth, a fifth, each attempt ending the same way. Frustration began to build inside her, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She was weak. She was useless. She would never be strong enough. "Stop," Dracula said, and she froze. He approached her and knelt once more, his crimson eyes meeting hers. "You are trying too hard," he said. "You are thinking too much. A blade is not about strength. It is about speed, precision, and intent. You do not need to overpower your enemy. You only need to be faster than them." He took the dagger from her hand and demonstrated, his movements so quick that she barely saw them. The blade flashed in the torchlight, cutting through the air with deadly grace, and then he handed it back to her. "Feel the weight," he said. "Feel the balance. Do not think. Do not hesitate. Simply move." Ilara took the dagger again, her hands steadier now. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let her mind go blank. Then she moved. The blade sliced through the air, and this time Dracula did not catch her wrist. He stepped aside at the last moment, the blade passing within inches of his arm. Ilara stumbled forward, caught off guard by her own success, and nearly dropped the dagger. "Better," Dracula said, a hint of approval in his voice. "Much better." Ilara looked up at him, her crimson eyes wide with surprise. "I almost hit you." "Almost," Dracula agreed. "But almost is not enough." Again. They trained for hours, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time seemed to blur in the depths of the castle, where no sunlight reached and no clocks ticked. Ilara's arms ached, her legs trembled, and sweat soaked through her oversized dress. But she did not stop. She could not stop, because with every swing of the blade, with every failed attempt and every small success, she felt herself becoming stronger, becoming more. Finally, Dracula called for a halt. Ilara collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath, the dagger slipping from her fingers and clattering to the floor. Her father stood over her, his expression as cold and unreadable as ever. "You did well," he said, "for a first lesson." Ilara looked up at him, her chest heaving. "Will I ever be as strong as you?" she asked. Dracula was silent for a long moment. Then he reached down and offered her his hand. "Perhaps," he said, "if you survive long enough to find out." Ilara took his hand and he pulled her to her feet. She swayed slightly, exhausted, but she did not fall. She would not fall. Not anymore. "Come," Dracula said, "you need rest. Tomorrow, we begin again." As they left the training chamber and climbed back into the upper levels of the castle, Ilara felt something shift inside her. She was no longer just a frightened child. She was something more, something darker, something that could fight back, and she would never be afraid again. 3 weeks had passed since Ilara's arrival at Castle Dracula, and the child had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Her skin, already pale, had taken on an almost translucent quality, and the dark circles beneath her crimson eyes had deepened, giving her the appearance of something ancient trapped in a young body. She moved differently now, with a grace and precision that no 5-year-old should possess. Her reflexes had sharpened, her senses had heightened, and the weakness she once felt in sunlight had grown more pronounced. She was becoming what her father had promised she would become, something caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. The training continued every evening without fail. Dracula was a merciless teacher, pushing her to the edge of exhaustion and then beyond. He taught her how to move in silence, how to read the shadows, how to sense danger before it arrived. He taught her the anatomy of mortals and monsters alike, showing her where to strike for maximum damage, where the blood flowed strongest, where the heart hid beneath bone and muscle. He taught her that mercy was a luxury she could not afford, that hesitation meant death, and that the world would show her no kindness simply because she was a child. And Ilara learned. She learned with a hunger that matched her father's own, absorbing every lesson, every correction, every brutal truth. She fell countless times, bled from countless cuts, and wept silent tears when she thought no one was watching, but she never stopped. She could not stop, because stopping meant admitting weakness, and weakness meant death. On the evening of the 21st day, Dracula led her to a different part of the castle, a tower that overlooked the valley below. The room at the top was circular, with narrow windows that allowed cold wind to whistle through. Maps covered the walls, marked with symbols and notations in languages Ilara did not recognize. A large telescope stood near one window, pointed at the distant villages that dotted the landscape, like fireflies in the darkness. "Come," Dracula said, gesturing her forward. "Look." Ilara approached the window and peered out into the night. Far below, she could see the lights of a village, small and flickering. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could hear faintly the sound of dogs barking and children laughing. It was a world she had once belonged to, a world that now seemed impossibly distant. "That village," Dracula said, standing beside her, "is where your mother lived, where you lived. Do you remember it?" Ilara's throat tightened. "Yes," she whispered. "Do you miss it?" She was silent for a long moment, her crimson eyes fixed on the distant lights. "No," she said finally. "They killed my mother. They tried to kill me. I have nothing there." "Good," Dracula said, "because they have not forgotten about you, and they will come for you soon." Ilara turned to look at him, her small face pale with understanding. "How do you know?" Dracula moved to the telescope and adjusted it slightly, then stepped back. "Look," he said. Ilara pressed her eye to the lens, and the village leaped into focus. She could see the streets now, the houses, the church with its crooked steeple, and she could see something else, a group of men gathered in the village square, armed with torches, crossbows, and silver weapons. They were speaking to a figure in black robes, a man with a cross hanging around his neck and a grim, weathered face. "A priest." "Who is he?" Ilara asked, her voice barely audible. "Father Cornelius," Dracula said, "a vampire hunter. One of the most dangerous mortals I have ever encountered. He has been tracking me for years, always one step behind, always just out of reach, but he is clever, patient, and utterly devoted to his cause. He believes God has ordained him to destroy me, and now it seems he has learned of your existence." Ilara pulled back from the telescope, her heart pounding. "What does he want?" "You," Dracula said simply. "He believes that if he can capture you, he can use you against me. He thinks you are my weakness, and he is right." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. Ilara stared at her father, searching his face for some sign of emotion, but his expression remained cold and unreadable. "What will you do?" she asked. "I will kill him," Dracula said. "I will kill all of them, but not yet. First, you must understand what we are facing. Father Cornelius is not like the villagers who murdered your mother. He is trained, experienced, and armed with knowledge that few mortals possess. He knows how to kill vampires, how to recognize dhampirs, and how to exploit weaknesses. If he reaches this castle, if he finds you, he will not hesitate to drive a stake through your heart." Ilara felt a chill run down her spine. "Then we should leave. We should go somewhere he can't find us." "There is nowhere he cannot find us," Dracula said. "He has the church behind him, resources I do not possess, and a faith that makes him fearless. Running would only delay the inevitable. No, we will face him here, on ground of our choosing. But you must be ready. You must be strong enough to fight, because I cannot protect you forever." "I'm only 5 years old," Ilara whispered, her voice breaking. "How can I fight someone like that?" Dracula knelt before her, his crimson eyes locking onto hers. "You are not only 5 years old," he said quietly. "You are my daughter. You carry my blood, my curse, and my strength. Age means nothing. Innocence means nothing. All that matters is survival. Do you understand?" Ilara nodded slowly, though fear gnawed at her insides. She understood. She had always understood. The world was cruel, and mercy was a lie. If she wanted to live, she would have to become something the world feared. "Good," Dracula said, rising to his feet. "Then we have work to do." The next 3 nights were the most brutal of Ilara's short life. Dracula pushed her harder than ever before, forcing her to fight against creatures he summoned from the depths of the castle, wolves with eyes like burning coals, skeletal servants who moved within human speed, and shadows that seemed to have minds of their own. She was bitten, clawed, thrown against walls, and left bleeding on the cold stone floor. But each time she fell, Dracula would stand over her and say the same thing, "Get up." And she would. Every time, because falling meant dying, and she refused to die. On the 4th night, as Ilara sat in the grand hall tending to her wounds, Renfield shuffled into the room, his face pale and his hands trembling. "Master," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "they are coming." Dracula, who had been standing by the fire, turned slowly. "How many?" 20 men, Renfield said. "Maybe more. They carry silver and holy water, and Father Cornelius leads them." Dracula's expression did not change, but Ilara saw something flicker in his eyes. Not fear, but anticipation. "Let them come," he said. "Prepare the castle. Seal the lower entrances and open the main gate. I want them to think they have an easy path inside." Renfield bowed and scurried away, muttering to himself. Elara stood, ignoring the pain in her side where a wolf's claws had torn through her dress. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. Dracula looked at her for a long moment, his gaze searching. "I want you to hide," he said finally. "Go to your room. Lock the door. Do not come out until I tell you it is safe." "No," Elara said, her voice firm despite her fear. "You said I had to be strong. You said I had to fight. I won't hide while you face them alone." "Elara!" "I won't," she interrupted, her crimson eyes blazing with defiance. "You taught me to survive. You taught me to fight. Now let me prove I can." Dracula stared at her, and for the first time Elara saw something in his face that might have been pride. "Very well," he said quietly. "But you will do exactly as I say. Do you understand?" "Yes," Elara said. "Then follow me." They descended into the depths of the castle once more, into the training chamber where Elara had first held a blade. Dracula moved to the wall of weapons and selected a short sword, its blade gleaming silver in the torchlight. He handed it to Elara, and she took it with both hands, feeling its weight settle into her grip. "This blade is blessed," Dracula said. "It can kill mortals and monsters alike, but it is also dangerous to me. If you strike me with it, even by accident, it will wound me gravely. Do you understand?" Elara nodded, her heart pounding. "Good. Now listen carefully. Father Cornelius will try to separate us. He will use fire, holy water, and blessed weapons to drive me back. When that happens, you will be vulnerable. He will see you as a tool, a hostage, a weapon to use against me. You must not let him take you. If he reaches for you, if he comes close, you strike. Do not hesitate. Do not ask questions. You strike and you kill. Do you understand?" "Yes," Elara whispered. Dracula placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but not unkind. "You are stronger than you know, Elara. Trust yourself. Trust your instincts. And remember, you are not a victim. You are a survivor." Before Elara could respond, a loud crash echoed through the castle, followed by the sound of splintering wood and shouting voices. The hunters had arrived. Dracula's eyes flashed crimson, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. "It begins," he said. He moved toward the door, his coat billowing behind him like wings, and Elara followed, the blessed sword clutched tightly in her hands. Her heart hammered in her chest, and her palms were slick with sweat, but she did not falter. She could not falter, because tonight she would prove that she was her father's daughter, and the world would learn to fear her name. They ascended the stairs and entered the grand hall just as the main doors burst open. 20 men poured inside, their faces grim and determined, their weapons gleaming in the firelight. At their head stood Father Cornelius, tall and broad-shouldered, his black robes billowing around him. He held a silver cross in one hand and a blessed sword in the other, and his eyes burned with righteous fury. "Dracula!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the hall. "Your reign of terror ends tonight. Surrender the child, and I will grant you a swift death." Dracula stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, and the firelight cast long shadows across his pale face. "You come into my home," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "and demand that I surrender my daughter. You are either very brave, Father, or very foolish." "She is an abomination," Cornelius roared. "A creature of darkness. She must be destroyed before she becomes like you." Elara stepped out from behind her father, the blessed sword raised, her crimson eyes glowing in the firelight. "I am already like him," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "and I will not be destroyed." The hunters stared at her in shock, their weapons faltering. They had expected a frightened child, a helpless victim. Instead, they saw something else, something small and pale and deadly, with eyes that burned like hellfire. Father Cornelius's face twisted with rage. "Kill them both," he shouted, and the battle began. The grand hall erupted into chaos. The hunters charged forward with a roar, their weapons raised, their faces twisted with fear and fury. Dracula moved like a shadow made flesh, his form blurring as he tore through their ranks with inhuman speed. Men screamed as his claws ripped through armor and bone, their blood spraying across the ancient stone walls. He was a whirlwind of death, unstoppable and merciless, and within moments, half the hunters lay dead or dying on the floor. But Father Cornelius was no ordinary man. He moved with purpose and precision, his blessed sword slicing through the air where Dracula had stood only a moment before. He threw vials of holy water that exploded like grenades, forcing Dracula back, creating distance between the vampire and his prey. The priest's eyes were sharp, calculating, and they kept darting toward Elara. She stood near the fireplace, her back against the wall, the blessed sword trembling in her small hands. 3 hunters had broken away from the main group and were advancing toward her, their crossbows loaded with silver bolts. They moved slowly, cautiously, as though approaching a wild animal. "Drop the weapon, child," one of them said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "We don't want to hurt you. We're here to save you from the monster." Elara's crimson eyes blazed. "He is not a monster," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "He is my father." The hunter's expression hardened. "Then you are as damned as he is." He raised his crossbow and time seemed to slow. Elara saw his finger tighten on the trigger, saw the bolt slide into place, saw the silver tip gleaming in the firelight. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "Do not hesitate, do not ask questions, you strike and you kill." She moved. The blessed sword flashed through the air, and the hunter's crossbow clattered to the floor, his hand severed cleanly at the wrist. He stared at the stump in shock, blood pouring from the wound, and then he screamed. Elara did not wait. She spun and drove the blade into his chest, feeling it punch through leather and flesh and bone. The man gasped once, blood bubbling from his lips, and then he collapsed. The other 2 hunters froze, their faces pale with horror. They had expected a frightened child. They had not expected this. Elara pulled the sword free and turned to face them, her small frame splattered with blood, her crimson eyes glowing with something dark and terrible. "Leave," she said quietly, "or die like he did." One of the hunters dropped his weapon and ran. The other hesitated, torn between duty and self-preservation, and in that moment of hesitation, Dracula appeared behind him. The vampire's hand closed around the man's throat, and there was a sickening crack. The hunter fell limp, and Dracula tossed his body aside like a broken doll. Father Cornelius roared in fury and charged toward them, his blessed sword raised high. Dracula moved to intercept, but the priest threw another vial of holy water directly at his face. The liquid burned like acid, and Dracula staggered back, his pale skin blistering and smoking. Cornelius pressed his advantage, his blade slicing through the air, forcing Dracula to retreat step by step. "You cannot protect her forever, monster," Cornelius shouted. "She is an abomination, a curse upon this world, and I will send her back to hell where she belongs." Elara's vision turned red. She did not think. She did not hesitate. She simply moved. She ran forward, her small legs carrying her faster than any mortal child should be able to run, and she drove the blessed sword toward Cornelius's exposed side. The priest sensed her at the last moment and twisted away, but not fast enough. The blade caught him across the ribs, slicing through his robes and drawing a line of blood. He gasped and stumbled backward, his hand clutching the wound, and his eyes widened in shock as he looked down at her. You are just a child," he whispered. "I am my father's daughter," Elara said coldly, "and you threatened what is mine." Cornelius's face twisted with rage and pain. He raised his sword to strike her down, but Dracula was already there. The vampire's hand closed around Cornelius's wrist, squeezing until bones cracked and the blessed sword clattered to the floor. Cornelius cried out and tried to pull free, but Dracula's grip was iron. "You came into my home," Dracula said, his voice soft and deadly. "You threatened my daughter, and now you will pay the price." He lifted Cornelius off the ground with one hand, the priest's feet dangling uselessly as he struggled and gasped for air. Dracula's fangs extended, gleaming white in the firelight, and he leaned close to the priest's throat. "Wait," Elara said. Dracula froze, his fangs inches from Cornelius's neck. He turned his head to look at his daughter, his crimson eyes questioning. Elara stepped forward, the blessed sword still clutched in her hands. Blood dripped from the blade, pooling on the floor at her feet. She looked up at Father Cornelius, at the man who had come to kill her, who had called her an abomination, who had tried to take away the only family she had left. "Why did you come here?" she asked quietly. "Why do you hate us so much?" Cornelius stared down at her, his face pale with pain and fear. "Because you are evil," he gasped. "Because you are creatures of darkness. Because God commands it." "God," Elara repeated softly. She looked at the cross hanging around Cornelius's neck, at the symbol of faith that had once meant something to her mother. "My mother believed in God. She prayed every night. She was kind and gentle and good, and your God let her burn. He let them kill her for no reason other than that she loved the wrong man. What kind of God does that?" Cornelius's mouth opened, but no words came out. He had no answer. He had never needed one before. Faith had always been enough. Elara lowered the sword and stepped back. "I won't kill you," she said, "but you need to understand something. My father is not the monster you think he is. He protected me when no one else would. He taught me to survive when the world wanted me dead, and I will not let you or anyone else take that away from me." She looked up at Dracula. "Let him go." Dracula stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he released his grip. Cornelius collapsed to the floor, coughing and gasping, his hand still clutching his wounded side. Dracula stepped back, and the firelight cast long shadows across his pale face. "Go," Dracula said quietly. "Tell your church what happened here tonight. Tell them that I spared you because my daughter asked me to, and tell them that if they ever come for her again, I will show them no mercy." Cornelius struggled to his feet, his face twisted with pain and humiliation. He stared at Ilara, at the small child with crimson eyes who had shown him more mercy than he had ever shown others, and something shifted in his expression. Not understanding, not acceptance, but the faintest glimmer of doubt. He turned and limped toward the door, leaving a trail of blood behind him. The few surviving hunters who had witnessed the battle followed him, their weapons abandoned, their faces pale with shock. The great doors closed behind them with a heavy thud, and silence fell over the hall. Ilara stood in the center of the carnage, surrounded by bodies and blood, the blessed sword still clutched in her hands. She felt numb, hollow, as though she had left a part of herself somewhere on the blood-soaked floor. She had killed a man tonight. She had driven a blade through his chest and watched the light leave his eyes. And she had felt nothing. Dracula approached her slowly, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He knelt before her and gently took the sword from her hands, setting it aside. Then he cupped her face in his pale hands, his crimson eyes searching hers. "You spared him," he said quietly. "Why?" Ilara's lower lip trembled, and tears began to spill down her cheeks. "Because I didn't want to become like them," she whispered. "I didn't want to be someone who kills without mercy, without reason. I didn't want to lose the part of me that remembers what it was like to be human." Dracula was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he pulled her into his arms and held her close. She buried her face in his chest and wept, her small body shaking with sobs, and for the first time since Elena's death she allowed herself to grieve, not just for her mother, but for the innocence she had lost, for the childhood that had been stolen from her, for the girl she could never be again. "You are stronger than I ever was," Dracula said softly, his voice barely audible. "You have something I lost centuries ago: compassion, mercy, humanity. Do not let this world take that from you, Ilara. Do not let it turn you into something you are not." Ilara pulled back and looked up at him, her crimson eyes filled with tears. "But you said mercy was a weakness. You said hesitation meant death." "I was wrong," Dracula said. "Mercy is not weakness. It is strength. The strength to choose kindness when the world demands cruelty. The strength to remember what you are fighting for, even when everything else is taken from you. Your mother had that strength, and now, so do you." He wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumb, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You are not just my daughter, Ilara. You are Elena's daughter, and that makes you something I could never be, something better." Ilara stared at him, her heart aching with a mixture of love and sorrow. "Will they come back?" she asked. "Will Father Cornelius return with more hunters?" "Perhaps," Dracula said, "or perhaps not. But it does not matter. We will face whatever comes together, and we will survive because that is what we do." He stood and offered her his hand. Ilara took it, her small fingers wrapping around his, and together they walked through the blood-soaked hall and up the stairs to the upper levels of the castle. The night was still young, and the storm that had been brewing on the horizon had finally arrived. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rolled across the mountains like the voice of an angry god. But inside the castle, in the small chamber where Ilara slept, there was warmth, there was safety, there was family. Dracula tucked her into bed, pulling the heavy blankets up to her chin, and sat beside her as he had done every night since she arrived. Ilara looked up at him, her crimson eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Will you stay with me?" she asked softly. "Just for tonight?" Dracula hesitated, then nodded. "I will stay." He remained there as she drifted off to sleep, her small hand clutching his, her breathing slow and steady. And as he watched her sleep, Count Dracula, the monster, the legend, the immortal terror of the Carpathian Mountains, felt something he had not felt in centuries: hope. Because in this small, cursed child, he had found something worth protecting, something worth fighting for, something worth living for, and perhaps, just perhaps, redemption was not as far away as he had once believed. The storm raged on through the night, but within the walls of Castle Dracula there was peace. And for the first time in 500 years, the Count was not alone.